speaker is MP Leah Gazan from NDP. The Honourable Leah Gazan has been the NDP Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre since 2019. She is the NDP critic for families, children and social development, critic for women and gender equality, and critic for post-secondary education. She's a member of Wood Mountain Lakota Nation and located in Saskatchewan Treaty 4 territory. Please welcome MP Leah Gazan.
Thank you all, and I know it's been a really long day, but I have to always ask when I go behind a podium, can you see me? So I just want to say that I'm just really honored to be invited to the Assembly to provide my perspectives and certainly the NDP perspectives on Bill C-5. And I wish to acknowledge the elders, certainly our very powerful national chief, the chiefs in Assembly, especially the Treaty 1 chiefs and nations, to share my very deep concerns about this piece of legislation. Bill C-5, from my perspective, is simply a power grab by Mark Carney's Liberal government under the guise of an emergency measure to deal with Trump. This legislation gives unprecedented, sweeping powers to ministers and cabinet to subjectively decide which projects are in national interest, and in doing so, bypass their constitutional obligation to consult, accommodate, and obtain consent from Indigenous peoples. And it is becoming clearer that Carney and the Liberals are using this moment of fear and uncertainty to do what so many consecutive governments have tried to do: ignore Indigenous peoples' constitutional rights and usurp our authority over our traditional lands by ignoring our Aboriginal and treaty rights that are recognized and affirmed in the Constitution Act of 1982. And this total disregard of our inherent and treaty rights became clear when the Prime Minister provided First Nations just 7 days to review and comment on a summary of this legislation, and then refused to slow down the process when National Chief Woodhouse called on the Liberals to do so during the committee review of Bill C-5. This normalized colonial behavior made it clear to me and many others that they are not willing to participate in meaningful discussions, let alone fulfill their constitutional obligation to consult, and their actions since the passing of this legislation are more powerful than their words. And this has been noted by First Nations leaders across the country. As many First Nations have pointed out, any mention of, in quotes, Indigenous interests or of the consultation process in Bill C-5 simply distracts from its failure to uphold the constitutional rights of Indigenous peoples, including the fact that Bill C-5 provides equal stakeholder status to private corporations and Indigenous peoples in the determination of projects of national interest. And let's be clear, corporations do not have constitutional status. We do. And among the factors considered under Bill C-5 to determine a project of, in quotes, national interest, Indigenous peoples are only listed in Section 5(6) of one of the considerations in the determination of a project of national interest. We are not a factor. We are rights holders, and the government is obliged to uphold their constitutional obligations to Indigenous peoples. So I have to tell you, I was shocked when I read the factors that will be used to decide on a project. Section 5(6) of Bill C-5 states that as follows: in deciding whether to make an order under Section 1 or 4 in respect of a project, the Governor and Council may consider any factor that the Government and Council considers relevant, including the extent to which the project can A, strengthen Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security. B, provide economic or other benefits to Canada. C, have a high likelihood of successful execution. D, advance the interests of Indigenous peoples. And C or E, contribute to clean growth and meeting Canada's objective with respect to climate change. We are one of the factors the government may consider relevant when deciding on a project of national interest. And more troubling is the fact that the government has provided ministers and cabinet with the ability to decide what is in our best interests. So it made me think of a historical example of when the federal government made decisions on our behalf in our best interest. And the example that came to mind was residential schools. Except now, instead of violently stealing our children, they are aggressively pursuing access to our lands, territories, and resources, violating our jurisdiction and violating our sovereignty, and without our free, prior, and informed consent. And you can put any face you want on that, but it doesn't change the intent. The government has an obligation and must uphold their obligations under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 that recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights, rights that all levels of government from all different stripes, all different parties continue to violate. This is what I know, however. When governments have tried to ignore these rights, Indigenous peoples have fought hard in the courts to protect our rights. And when challenged, we have won the majority of cases in the Supreme Court of Canada. We just need to have faith in our power. We are not just powerful as peoples. Don't forget this. We have also demonstrated we are powerful in the courts. In fact, the Supreme Court talked about reconciliation even before the TRC was established. Let me give you just one example, and the example that came to mind is the Haida Nation case in 2004, where the Supreme Court determined, one, the objective is to reconcile the pre-existing sovereignty of Indigenous peoples with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. So what does that mean? It means that the Crown needs to reconcile our sovereignty as inherent and theirs that has been imposed. Unfortunately, Bill C-5 continues this pattern of colonial violence by usurping our jurisdiction and sovereignty, by giving cabinet and ministers the power to determine projects of national interest without our involvement and without our free, prior, and informed consent. The Haida Nation case also determined that on important matters, governments are required to obtain full consent of Indigenous people. And I think all of you would agree with me here that projects of national interest are in fact an important matter. The Supreme Court added that this principle applied to both treaty and non-treaty areas. Bill C-5 makes no reference to consent. In fact, referring back to Article 5.6, the factors that will be used to determine a project of national interest are made by cabinet and ministers and without the involvement of Indigenous peoples. Bill C-5 even disrespects precedent-setting cases that have ruled in our favor at the Supreme Court level. Now, I know that ministers have gone on what I've called a national disinformation tour, having meetings with First Nations across the country after the passing of Bill C-5 in an attempt to reassure us of our involvement, which is not affirmed in Bill C-5. Trust us. Well, I have, and I think all of us have almost 160 years to know what that looks like, starting with the times of residential school and before. So this is the pattern. When we say no, they send in militarized RCMP, overreach that has been criticized at the United Nations level, And I have to say, personally, I don't have a lot of trust. What I have to say is I'll believe it when you put it in the bill, a bill they passed without our free, prior, and informed consent. Bill C-5 is also in violation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As you all know, the UN Declaration had application in Canadian law even prior to the passing of Bill C-15, which was adopted in 2021, under which the, in quotes, Government of Canada must take all measures to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration, all laws. Does C-5 respect UNDRIP? No, it does not. And I know that even the Crown of the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations agrees with me. During a committee study on Bill C-5, in my question period, I shared that, in quotes, Article 19 of UNDRIP provides that states need to obtain free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people before adopting any legislative measure that may affect them. I then asked the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, in quotes, has the federal government upheld this obligation with Bill C-5, yes or no? The minister's response, in quotes, so this process has been an accelerated process for legislation, and when I pushed her to respond, she was unable to answer with an unqualified yes to my question. Yet when I asked Minister LeBlanc, in quotes, if Quebec says no to a pipeline, would you respect that? He was quick to answer. In quotes, the Prime Minister has been clear that he does not see us using this legislation over the objections of a province. No hesitation, no long-winded answer, and it was clear to me in that moment that they respect the jurisdiction of provinces. In fact, they had a First Minister's meeting to discuss Bill C-5 prior to being passed and prior to it being tabled. For us, after it was passed, nothing in legislation that affirms our rights. They did not fulfill their duty to consult and accommodate. They did not respect the Constitution. UNDRIP is clear when it comes to the duty of governments to consult. Article 32 in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that, in quotes, the approval of any project affecting Indigenous peoples, lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with development, utilization or exploitation of mineral, water or other resources, states must obtain free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. So what does this mean? It means free of coercion, prior to anything occurring or activity undertaking, and knowing what you have agreed to. And if you have not met those conditions, there is no real consent. And this is obviously not what Bill C-5 aims to do. So it's not surprising, and I'm very happy to see many First Nations are challenging Bill C-5 in the courts. The Crown has failed to uphold UNDRIP and FPIP, obligations which were affirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada. And let's not ignore the climate emergency we are in and the climate amnesia that current politicians seem to suffer from, like in Manitoba, where we are seeing an increase in catastrophic climate events resulting in climate refugees who are forced to leave their nation and come to urban centres where they're at high risk of exploitation, including sexual exploitation. Yet every year, all levels of government act like it's the first time it has ever happened, even though it happens annually. I drive down the streets of Winnipeg Centre. This is the riding that I represent. And I see evacuees without supports, without dignified housing, without long-term plans to address our changing world. And I have to ask, is ensuring the safety of evacuees not of national interest? Is ensuring the safety of women and girls from sexual exploitation not of national interest? Is ensuring long-term and safe housing for evacuees who are not able to return home not of national interest? Is ensuring strong environmental standards at a time when we are seeing a climate shift threatening our way of life, not of national interest. And under Bill C-5, apparently this is not a concern because it allows ministers to bypass critical environmental laws such as the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the Impact Assessment Act, the Fisheries Act, the Species at Risk Act, the Migratory Birds Convention Act, the Canadian Energy Regulatory Act, possibly jeopardizing the integrity and safety of traditional territories, as well as traditional hunting and fishing activities. And as if that wasn't enough, environmental processes provided for under modern land claims agreements are simply eliminated and replaced by cabinet. Now, if that is not a substantial amendment to these agreements considered treaties without consent of Indigenous signatories, then the constitutional status of those agreements is also ignored. The far-reaching implications of Bill C-5 cannot be overstated. And as the Climate Action Network has stated, in quotes, greenlighting major project upfront before asking how it affects communities is nonsensical. It is in the national interest to allow for public participation, uphold Indigenous rights, and protect our shared climate, lands, waters, and air, not to rush through resource extraction projects. And I have to say, in my opinion, the actual threat is not Trump, where there is a widely reported and visible, in quotes, mental decline. But he has become now the excuse for fast-tracking the infringement of our rights. The emergency, in my opinion, is a growing climate crisis and a failure of colonial governments to meet the moment, including the widely reported social impacts around resource and extraction projects where we witness increased violence against Indigenous women and girls. In fact, CTV just reported data that showed while Winnipeg has a high concentration of murdered and disappeared cases of Indigenous women, the number of sex ads was relatively sparse compared to other cities such as Edmonton. Why? The data connected the host number of ads to oil drilling rigs and mining operations in Alberta, leading to an increase in sex trafficking, with Saskatchewan and Manitoba becoming feeder provinces for victims. And as I've said many times, and as other matriarchs often state, the violence that is occurring with Mother Earth is the same violence being perpetrated against Indigenous women and girls. You cannot separate the threats of violence to life givers. We are all part of the circle. We are sacred. And what is the federal government's plan to deal with this crisis? No plan. When I asked the Minister of Natural Resources if he was aware of, in quotes, the increased violence against Indigenous women and girls that will result from fast-tracking oil and gas projects without putting in place safety plans for communities hosting resource extraction companies, he brushed me off, questioned the relevance of my question, and then, although he indicated he was aware of the Status of Women study, which examined the relationship between resource extraction camps and violence against Indigenous women and girls, he did not take time to read it. It was a critical study that affirmed calls for justice to hold resource extraction companies responsible for violence against Indigenous women and girls occurring around resource extraction camps, something that I pushed the minister on, who brushed me off once again, stating, in quotes, that that was an issue for law enforcement. The ongoing genocide against Indigenous women and girls is clearly not of national interest with this Liberal government. And this is complicated, but it's not. Because I want to end with a story. Broken Head First Nation Chief Gord Bluesky and his council put forward a vote to the people of Broken Head First Nation to decide whether or not to approve a silica mine project agreement. The choice? To approve a project that would potentially provide much-needed economic revenue for the nation, or to not approve the project. One of the key concerns was the environmental impacts it could have on Broken Head and the surrounding communities. Meetings were tense and discussions were heated. Names were called and some conflicts ensued, and it was clear from the outside that voters had chosen where they wanted to vote. It was difficult, uncomfortable, and in the end, the majority of members voted to not move ahead with the project. But here's the thing. Chief Gord Bluesky respected the will of the rights holders. He did not receive an adequate level of consent to move forward with the project. He respected the will of the rights holders. That, my friends, is good governance. That is an example of upholding rights in contrast to the Liberal government. Chief Gord Bluesky put it in the hands of the ultimate right holders and let them decide, and in spite of differences, he upheld their human right to say yes, no, yes with conditions, or maybe another time. Unfortunately, this level of consultation and consent is not being upheld by all levels of colonial governments who are trying to assert their assumed sovereignty over the jurisdiction sovereignty, two words that I often hear at AFN assemblies over the years, and constitutionally recognized and affirmed rights of Indigenous peoples. And I share that story with you with the permission of my good friend Chief Bluesky, because we should not accept anything less. These are our rights. This is our power. These are our lands, our territories, and resources. And this is our future to decide, nobody else. Because can you imagine, in spite of our difference, if we decided to move forward in a unified effort? Because I can. I actually dream about it all the time. Thank you very much, and hope you have good discussions in your meetings ahead.